Jon Snow stood upon the ramparts of Highgarden with the wind rustling his dark cloak, gazing out over the endless fields of golden wheat that stretched toward the horizon. The Tyrells' farmland was indeed a sight to behold, an ocean of sustenance that could feed entire kingdoms. Once, House Tyrell had prided itself on its bountiful harvests and the generosity that flowed from Highgarden's gates. Now, in these tumultuous times, that same bounty had become a weapon more potent than any sword or spear. Jon understood well the gravity of his decision. He was no strategist by birth, no cunning spymaster shaped by decades of intrigue. He was a man who had learned through hardship and warfare, and the lessons echoed in his mind. Honor had its place, but to protect the realm, he might have to employ methods he once thought unthinkable. Though his heart clenched at the thought of causing suffering to innocents, he knew the alternative might be even darker. His breath lingered in the air, carrying the faintest hint of autumn as it drifted away. It was still warm in the Reach, but the changing of the seasons was upon them. Winter, he reminded himself, was always coming. He had tried so desperately to unify the realm to stand against the impending darkness beyond the wall. While the Night King was defeated and the White Walkers gone, the entire war culminating in that fateful battle at Winterfell, there was still the matter of mortal politics. The Iron Throne had become a greater threat in many ways, inciting strife and dividing the living just when unity was most needed. King's Landing, under a leadership Jon deemed dangerous and unfit, was orchestrating chaos. No matter the occupant of that throne, it seemed that the capital would forever spin webs of betrayal and bloodshed that ensnared them all. Jon had already left behind many illusions about the romantic idea of kingship. His short time as king in the north and his subsequent reluctant claim to the throne, backed by lineage more than ambition, had taught him that wearing the crown came at a steep cost. Yet his sense of duty could not be dissolved so easily. A letter had arrived 1 moon ago bearing news that King's Landing had slid once again into tyranny. The small folk faced higher taxes, forced conscriptions, and the ever-watchful eyes of the City Watch, who now took orders from a council of self-serving lords. The name on the letter was Gendry Baratheon, newly minted Lord of Storm's End, who warned that unrest was simmering, and if it boiled over, it could lead to civil war or worse. Jon had also heard rumors from Yara Greyjoy about raids on the western coasts, spurred by some who claimed loyalty to the crown. The Lannister line, though broken and scattered, still had pockets of influence that clung to King's Landing, manipulating the young and hapless puppet rulers. All these tidings weighed upon Jon's conscience. He had sworn, in his own way, to protect the realm, an oath that once led him to relinquish his own claim and retreat to the north. But the world kept pulling him back, testing him as though the gods refused to let him rest. Thus, he found himself in Highgarden with Ser Davos Seaworth, Ser Brienne of Tarth, and a handful of loyal men who believed in him not because of his name, but because of who he was. The Tyrell line, as he had known it, was gone. Olenna, Marjorie, Loras, all perished in the fires of war. Yet, the gardens and fields remained under the stewardship of Lady Marlora Tyrell, a distant cousin of the late Mace Tyrell. She had been kept from the intrigues of court, living as a ward in Dorne until the turbulence of the last war settled. Now that she had inherited Highgarden, she felt burdened with a responsibility too immense for one so young. Jon had met Marlora Tyrell upon his arrival, finding her to be soft-spoken, cautious, and understandably frightened at the prospect of stepping into the viper's pit of Westerosi power games. She had only just begun to exercise her authority as Lady of Highgarden, and now Jon Snow was asking her to do the unimaginable: block the flow of grain to King's Landing, effectively starving the capital until the occupant of the throne relented or was overthrown. It was a colossal risk that could tarnish House Tyrell's reputation forever. Yet it was also an opportunity to wrest power away from those who used the throne to subjugate the realm. In the heart of Highgarden's Great Hall, he had stood before Marlora Tyrell. The space was bathed in bright sunlight that filtered through colored glass, sending shards of rainbow hues across the polished marble floors. The tapestries depicted scenes of harvest festivals and knights in green-golden livery. The gentle perfume of fresh flowers lingered in the air: roses, lilies, and even some exotic species from across the narrow sea that had once been gifts to the Tyrells. With everyone dismissed save for Jon, Davos, and Brienne, the young lady had clasped her hands before her, her gaze weighing the gravity of Jon's words. "How many in King's Landing will die?" she asked, and there was a tremor in her voice. Jon took a moment, taking in the sight of the dais where the high seat of House Tyrell stood vacant. He spoke softly. "I can't say precisely. The city is large, and famine is an indiscriminate weapon. But if we act swiftly, there may be fewer deaths than if we engaged in open war. The current regime allows suffering as it is. If we do nothing, the city might tear itself apart from the inside. We're trying to force a swift end, to break them without a drawn-out siege of bloodshed." Marlora's shoulders stiffened. She was not naive. She had heard tales of King's Landing during wartime, how quickly the storehouses could run empty and how the poor often starved first. Will they not hate us? Will they not curse House Tyrell for starving them? Davos spoke then, his voice rough but sincere. "They may hate us, my lady. People often hate those who take desperate measures. But remember, they already see the Tyrell banners as symbolizing wealth and plenty. If we do nothing, we abandon them to a fate of oppressive rule. Sometimes, being a leader means doing what is necessary, even if it blackens your name for a time." The hall fell silent except for the chirping of birds outside the high windows. Marlora nodded. Jon could see the tears she fought to keep at bay. She thought of her ancestors, proud and generous, feeding the kingdom. Now she would be the one to withhold that blessing. At last she said, "I will cooperate, Lord Snow, but promise me you will do everything in your power to keep the suffering to a minimum. I do not want a million small folk blaming us for their children's empty bellies." Jon stepped forward and placed a hand lightly on her arm, his voice resolute. "I will do what I must to protect them, Lady Marlora. This is not an act of cruelty for cruelty's sake. Once the city yields, we can restore the supply lines. But the fate of the realm hinges on having a leadership in King's Landing that serves its people, not one that bleeds them dry." With that compact formed, the wheels of fate began to turn. Over the following weeks, under discreet orders, the Tyrell banners halted all grain shipments bound for King's Landing. Merchant caravans were either diverted or recalled entirely. Farmers and cotters loyal to Highgarden were instructed to store their harvest in hidden granaries. Any shipments that had to pass through the Crownlands were accompanied by heavily guarded escorts, ensuring none of the food would find its way into the capital's hands. The blockade remained secret at first, overshadowed by the usual disruptions that plagued trade routes post-war. But soon, as the city's storehouses began to dwindle, suspicion took root. Tensions rose. King's Landing was a city that relied heavily on imports from the Fertile Reach. The Crownlands could sustain some small portion of grain production, but it was nowhere near enough to feed the swollen population. Refugees who had fled the violence elsewhere had taken shelter in the city, and the new regime's desire to project power had lured more than a few opportunists within its walls. Whispers spread through alleyways and taverns that House Tyrell, now allied with the so-called bastard king in the north, sought to starve them all. Jon knew each day that passed brought them closer to the tipping point, and not all in King's Landing would simply bow to hunger. Desperate men with swords were likely to take to the roads, attempting to raid farmland for supplies. Thus, Jon prepared. He commanded fortifications along the Rose Road and arranged with loyal bannermen to stand guard near strategic farmland. He had ravens sent to Storm's End to entreat Gendry Baratheon to keep the sea routes closed. Yara Greyjoy, under a grudging truce, agreed to help patrol the waters off the coast, ensuring that merchant ships laden with grain would be intercepted before they could reach the capital. In those days, Highgarden was a hive of quiet activity. Blacksmiths toiled late into the night forging additional weapons, while outriders rode to and fro with messages for the allied lords. Ser Brienne oversaw the training of a new levy of soldiers, drilling them in discipline and formation. The Tyrell men-at-arms, though not as numerous as in the heyday of Mace Tyrell, were well-equipped and fiercely protective of their homeland. Meanwhile, Jon consulted maps of the Crownlands and engaged in long discussions with Ser Davos, who had smuggling experience and knew how to blockade a city's lifelines. Davos, for his part, lamented the necessity of it but recognized the strategic advantage. The first sign of success and tragedy arrived in the form of a scattered group of peasants who reached Highgarden after a harrowing journey. They spoke of how bread in King's Landing had skyrocketed in price, so much that only lords and wealthy merchants could afford a proper meal. Soup kitchens run by the faith tried to ease the burden, but supplies were too scarce. The city watch had grown more aggressive, seizing whatever grain they could from small folk. Riots broke out in Flea Bottom. The Red Keep responded with a heavy hand, using the city watch to quell dissent. The once bustling markets of King's Landing had started to resemble a battlefield of the desperate. Jon listened to their stories in grim silence. He would give them sanctuary and a share of Highgarden's surplus if they swore no harm. As more refugees trickled in, Lady Marlora had her steward open portions of the outer bailey to house them temporarily. The castle that once held lavish tournaments and feasts now swelled with hungry mouths. Marlora, seeing the human cost firsthand, approached Jon late one evening in the gardens. The air was thick with the scent of roses, but tension weighed heavily between them. She spoke softly, her voice tinged with sorrow. "Is there no other way? Perhaps we can send an envoy. Demand that the king, or whatever council controls King's Landing, step down peacefully." Jon looked at her, the moonlight casting shadows across his tired features. "We've tried words many times in the past. They fall on deaf ears. Our envoys are dismissed or worse. This blockade is our envoy now. If their hold on power weakens enough, they'll be forced to negotiate or removed by their own. I don't relish this, Lady Marlora, but I see no alternative." She nodded, biting her lip as though to keep from voicing further protest. She understood logically, but her heart ached for the city. A single tear slipped down her cheek, though she made no sound as she turned and left. Jon stood there amid the roses, feeling the night's chill seep into his bones. He recalled the vow he had made to this land, to protect it from the horrors beyond the wall, and the vow he had made to its people to do what was right. Now he was walking a precarious path. One false step, and he could become a monster in the eyes of those he sought to save. News from the capital continued to arrive in fragments. The price of breadsword, the new monarchy, if it could even be called that, tried to ration what little food remained. But the situation was dire. The puppet rulers, some rumored to be Lannister cousins, others claiming distant Targaryen blood, bickered amongst themselves, each jockeying for a stronger position. Some soldiers deserted, stealing provisions as they fled. The small folk, trapped and starving, grew more resentful by the day. Davos's ravens also brought word from Storm's End. Gendry wrote that a handful of ships carrying grain from Essos had managed to slip through his blockade, but it was not nearly enough to feed the entire city. The seeds of rebellion were being planted. The question was, who would harvest them first? Jon was certain that any day now, an uprising would begin. If not carefully guided, the city could collapse into chaos, a second King's Landing inferno for the realm to mourn. With that in mind, Jon began preparations for a final move, a coordinated push toward King's Landing when the time was ripe. But he did not plan to storm the walls with an army, nor did he intend to blaze a path of destruction through the Crownlands. He believed there would come a moment when the city's defenders would falter, their loyalty broken by empty stomachs and empty promises. When that happened, Jon Snow intended to be waiting just beyond the horizon, offering a chance at peace. In the meantime, he arranged quiet meetings with envoys who slipped out of the city. Members of the faith militant, disillusioned nobles, and a few common folk who had ties to certain factions in the capital met with Jon's representatives in hidden camps along the Rose Road. They plotted the best ways to ease the transition of power. Many of them said the same thing. The city was ripe for revolution, but no one was quite sure who should lead. All the old names were tarnished: Targaryen, Lannister, Baratheon, even Stark. The people yearned for a ruler who understood them, who would not hold them hostage. Jon insisted he had no interest in taking the throne. He had learned that lesson the hard way. Yet the question remained, If not him, then who? In this matter, Ser Davos proved invaluable. He had a talent for seeing men's hearts more clearly than most. He believed that no matter who sat the throne, the real question was the structure of governance. Could the realm survive under a single monarch, or would it be better served by a council? These ideas were too radical for some of the older lords, but others, seeing the cycle of war after war, began to wonder if it was time for something new. Jon listened intently, though he did not commit to any one path. He knew the realm was on the cusp of change. He could feel it like a storm on the wind. But that storm's final shape was not yet clear. As autumn deepened, King's Landing's plight worsened. Raven after raven brought tidings of bred riots, the burning of small storehouses by looters, and pitched battles in the streets. The capital's guard had neither the resources nor the organization to maintain order. The rumor was that the so-called king, a distant Lannister cousin named Garren Lannister, had fled the Red Keep in the night, disappearing with a handful of guards and as much gold as they could carry. In his absence, a council of opportunistic lords claimed interim leadership. But their rule was even less stable. Jon could imagine the chaos in the throne room. Nobles screaming at each other, each trying to pass blame for the city's suffering. Finally, a message arrived that the city gates were being overwhelmed by mobs of small folk attempting to flee. The Gold Cloaks tried to stop them, but they were outnumbered. The day after that, a second message came from a group of minor lords who had managed to hold a portion of the city in relative stability. They begged for parley with Jon Snow, entreating him to lift the blockade if a new leadership could be installed. Jon took this as the moment he had been waiting for. He gathered his forces, no mighty horde, but a disciplined host made up of Northmen loyal to him, reachmen under House Tyrell's banner, and a scattering of knights from Tarth, Storm's End, and even a few Ironborn from Yara's band. It was a patchwork army, united not by ancient oaths to a single king, but by a shared desire to see peace restored to the realm. Jon rode at the head, Ghost padding silently beside his horse. For a brief moment, he remembered the first time he had marched south from Winterfell as king in the north, his heart full of hope that he could unite the living against the dead. Now the enemy was mortal, yet the stakes felt no less daunting. As they neared the outskirts of King's Landing, the signs of desperation were everywhere. Small villages that once relied on trade with the capital were deserted, their inhabitants either starved or fled. Fields stood neglected. The roads were littered with broken carts, empty barrels, and the occasional corpse. A sense of dread and guilt gnawed at Jon with each passing mile. Was this the price of a better future for the realm? He told himself it was not just him but the system that had failed these people, forcing his hand. Even so, the weight of their suffering pressed down upon him like a yoke. When at last they glimpsed the walls of King's Landing, the city was cloaked in a haze of smoke rising from countless fires. The stench of decay and despair was unmistakable. Jon's host halted at a safe distance, pitching tents in formation. He did not want to be perceived as an invading army set on pillage. Rather, he wanted the city to see them as a stabilizing force. He dispatched riders to the gates, carrying banners of parley. The next morning, the gates cracked open just wide enough to let out a ragged envoy. They were a sorry sight, gaunt-faced men with hollow eyes, wearing once fine robes that hung on their withered frames. They knelt before Jon's council of captains and lords, declaring that King's Landing had no rightful king at present. The small council had dissolved, and the Gold Cloaks could no longer enforce order. All that remained was a fractious set of power brokers, each holding a piece of the city. They begged Jon to restore the flow of grain, offering in return the capitulation of the capital. Jon listened, saying little. Finally, he asked, "If we lift the blockade and feed the people, how do we ensure that power does not simply revert to another tyrant the moment bellies are full?" One of the envoys, a noble with sunken cheeks, wrung his hands. "My lord, we are beyond choosing new tyrants. The city is in ruins. The throne room is empty. If you do not come to restore order, we fear a total collapse. The small folk are armed, roving in mobs. If another warlord emerges, we will have no means to stop them." At that, Ser Davos gave Jon a pointed look. Jon took a moment to consider. He might take the city by force, but that would only perpetuate the cycle. Instead, he proposed a plan. A transitional council representing various factions, the nobility, the faith, the guilds of merchants, and the common folk would be formed. This council, with Jon acting as a mediator, would work toward a stable form of governance. He did not intend to remain in King's Landing indefinitely, but for a time, he would serve as protector of the capital, ensuring that supplies from the Reach were distributed fairly. The envoys exchanged uncertain glances. They had never heard of such a proposal. Westeros was a land of kings, lords, and knights, not councils. But the alternative was grim. The city was on the brink of dissolution. So they agreed, or at least they felt they had no choice but to agree. That night, while the terms were being written and sealed, Jon laked through the camp, hearing the chatter of his men. Some were uneasy, worrying that feeding the city might empower the same factions they had starved. Others were relieved to avoid a bloody siege. In a quiet corner of the camp, near the cooking fires, Jon found Ser Brienne. She was tending to her horse, her expression as pensive as he'd ever seen. She inclined her head in greeting, and Jon asked her thoughts. "I believe in you," she said plainly, "but I worry that the capital is a nest of vipers. Your plan may be too idealistic." Jon managed a tired smile. "Perhaps, but I have to try. Too many people have died for one throne. The wars, the dragonfire, the madness. It has to stop somewhere." Brienne nodded, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Then let us bring as much honor as we can to this. The realm is watching." The next day, Jon and his retinue approached the gates under the banner of peace. The sun struggled to break through a grimy haze that lingered over the city. Outside the walls, a crowd of desperate small folk gathered, hoping to see the promise of relief. Soldiers from Jon's host distributed bread from their own supplies, sparingly, for they could not feed the entire city without opening the Tyrell granaries. Weary men, women, and children swarmed around them, eyes alight with hunger and the faintest flicker of hope. Entering King's Landing, Jon noticed the immediate devastation. Burned-out hovels, streets piled with refuse, bodies left in the gutters. The stench was overpowering, a brutal testament to the blockade's effect. He maintained a stoic countenance, but inside, he felt his heart wrench at the sight. Davos, riding next to him, whispered that the city had seen better days even during the worst of past sieges. This was a slow, insidious collapse from within. Ghosts stayed close, growling low at the sense of despair that permeated the place. They proceeded to the Red Keep, its once imposing walls showing signs of disrepair. The castle guards, lacking any central authority, stood listless, uncertain whether to stop them. Finally, a few recognized Jon Snow, the legendary figure who had fought the White Walkers. They stepped aside, letting him pass. Inside the keep, the corridors were dim, many torches unlit to conserve resources. Jon could almost feel the ghosts of the past, Cersei Lannister skulking down these halls, Tyrion brooding in corners, and Jaime's footsteps echoing before his last stand. All of them gone, leaving a broken capital in their wake. The throne room was eerily silent. The great doors groaned open to reveal the Iron Throne at the far end, illuminated by streaks of sunlight spilling through fractured windows. Several lords and ladies, thin and haunted, awaited Jon's arrival. Their attire was threadbare or patched, jewels having been sold or bartered in desperate attempts to secure food. The hollow gazes of courtiers who had once lived lavishly in the shadow of the throne told a story of a city brought to its knees. Jon strode forward, accompanied by Davos, Brienne, and a handful of guards. He stopped several paces away from the dais. The Iron Throne, a twisted mass of swords, sat vacant. A few candles flickered around it, their light feeble against the gloom. Jon did not ascend the steps, did not place himself on that seat of power. Instead, he turned to face the assembled lords and ladies. "People of King's Landing," he began, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. "I come not to claim this throne, but to end the suffering that has befallen our realm. For too long, the city has been starved by our blockade, an action I do not celebrate but deem necessary. War and tyranny have plagued King's Landing for years. Now, we have an opportunity to break that cycle and create a just governance for all. Will you stand with me? A murmur rippled through the gathering. Some nodded eagerly, desperate for any relief. Others glared with suspicion, wondering what trick this northern lord might have in store. An older man with a threadbare coat of arms coughed into his fist, stepping forward. "My lord, we have no strength left to oppose you, nor do we desire to continue this madness. If you can feed the city and restore order, I will lend my name to whatever counsel you propose." A woman with graying hair and a proud but forlorn mien spoke next. "We are at your mercy, Lord Snow. Do what you must. The Iron Throne is there for the taking, if that is your wish." Jon turned his gaze to the throne, a swirl of memories and emotions flickering through his mind. But he shook his head. "I do not wish to sit upon it. If I have a role in the new order, it will be as a protector, ensuring the distribution of food and the fair treatment of the people until a permanent system can be established. Let it be known that I come with supplies from Highgarden, but they will be rationed according to need, not privilege." He could see how that idea rattled the lords and ladies. They were accustomed to having first claim on resources. But the times had changed, and whether they liked it or not, the new arrangement was non-negotiable. Some might resist, but in their weakened state, they had little leverage. And so began the unsteady formation of a transitional council. Representation included a few of the remaining great houses, members of the faith, and even leaders of the merchant guilds and the common folk. Meetings were held in smaller chambers, away from the grandeur of the throne room, to keep the mood more practical, less theatrical. Over the course of weeks, shipments of grain began to flow from Highgarden once more. The roads, now manned by Jon's forces, were secured. Brienne oversaw the distribution points in the city, ensuring that no single faction could hoard the supplies. While the blockade was technically lifted, it was transformed into a regulated supply chain, with the Tyrell granaries carefully monitoring how much grain was released to the capital. Lady Marlora Tyrell had traveled to the outskirts of the city, though she rarely ventured inside, as the sight of suffering overwhelmed her. Nonetheless, her presence reaffirmed House Tyrell's commitment to a stable transition. Gradually, the tension in King's Landing eased. The breadlines were still long, but at least people no longer feared total starvation. The small folk, given access to some sustenance, began to calm. The City Watch, reorganized under Jon's advisement, patrolled the streets with clearer guidelines. Root out banditry, protect the innocent, and arrest those who sought to disrupt the fragile peace. Leaders of the new council negotiated daily, hammering out how taxes would be levied, how laws would be enforced, and which lords held legitimate claims. It was messy work, but it showed the realm a glimpse of something different, a governance formed not solely by bloodright but by necessity and consensus. Of course, not everyone was content. Some highborn lords chafed at seeing their wealth and privilege curtailed. A faction within the city seethed at Jon Snow's interference, whispering that this was all a ploy for the Starks to effectively rule the capital. Rumors circulated that Daenerys Targaryen's loyalists might return, or that another claimant would rise with an army of mercenaries from across the sea. Jon had no illusions that this fragile peace would be unchallenged. Still, day by day, King's Landing inched away from the brink of total ruin. As winter's chill began to settle upon the Crownlands, an assembly was held in the courtyard of the Red Keep, an unprecedented gathering open to both lords and common folk. A platform was erected, and a line of armed guards kept a respectful perimeter. Jon Snow stood at the forefront with Ser Davos, Brienne, Lady Marlora Tyrell, and representatives of the council. The Iron Throne loomed silently inside the keep, but here in the open air, among the people, a new direction for Westeros was to be announced. When Jon stepped forward, the murmuring crowd fell quiet. He spoke with clarity and purpose. "I have stood in the north. I have fought the dead. I have watched lords betray their own kind for the sake of power. I have seen the suffering of the small folk in a war that seems unending. I cannot promise miracles, but I can promise a chance at a new beginning. From this day forward, King's Landing will be governed by a council representing the realm's varied interests until a permanent resolution is reached. No single monarch shall claim these people as theirs to command. Not until the realm decides by consensus who has earned such trust, if indeed we choose another monarch at all. A quiet murmur rippled through the gathering. Some nodded. Others exchanged wary glances. Many had never known anything but rule by a king or queen. The idea that they might govern themselves, even partially, was both thrilling and terrifying. The lord who had spoken in the throne room, with sunken cheeks, came forward. "We agree in principle, Lord Snow, but the realm is vast. Will the other great houses accept such a change? Will Dorne, the Vale, the North remain at peace with such an arrangement?" Davos stepped up, his gruff voice carrying. "We cannot speak for every corner of Westeros, my lord, but we can set an example here. Our hope is that once they see a city thriving without the burden of a tyrant, they may join us in forging a new path." Brienne added, "Should they choose a king, it will be one who has proven themselves worthy. Let us not rush back into old patterns." The crowd was silent for a long moment. Then a voice from the back, belonging to a common man, shouted, "What if we do want a king? Is Jon Snow not the rightful heir?" Jon felt all eyes turn upon him. He took a measured breath. "I was raised a bastard in the north. My mother's name is not widely known. My father's lineage uncertain until recent discoveries. Yet I have no desire for the Iron Throne. If the realm wishes to name a king or queen, let them do so through their lords or through this council. I will not stand in their way, and I will not take the throne by force." A smattering of applause, cautious but heartfelt, broke out. People admired his refusal of power, which was so unlike the rulers they had known. In that moment, Jon realized the blockade had served its grim purpose. The city had been brought to its knees, forced to confront the harsh truth of its reliance on the grain from the Reach. Now, with starvation abated and no single tyrant at the helm, King's Landing stood at the threshold of transformation. The cost had been great, and the future was far from certain, but an ember of hope glowed amid the ruins. As the assembly dispersed, Jon stood with Davos and Brienne, gazing over the cityscape. Smoke still trailed from a few battered neighborhoods, but the day was clear, and the crowd's mood felt lighter than it had in months. Brienne touched Jon's shoulder gently. "You've given them a chance," she said. "It might be the best any of us can do." Jon nodded, his eyes reflecting a distant sadness. "We'll see if they make the most of it." Then he turned to Davos. "We should arrange for the distribution of more grain. Winter is coming, and the people will need all the help they can get." Davos agreed, and they went to finalize the details with the new council. Highgarden would continue to send caravans, and Storm's End would open its ports to trade again. Yara Greyjoy had signaled she'd release her hold on the sea blockade, satisfied that the city would not revert to the old ways so easily. The City Watch, now reorganized, would guard the roads to ensure safe passage for merchants and farmers alike. It was a fragile ecosystem, but it was a start. That evening, Jon returned to his quarters in the Red Keep, quarters that had once housed lesser courtiers, with a decent bed and a small fireplace. Ghost curled up near the hearth, ever watchful. Jon busied himself reading letters from various lords who sought to understand the situation in King's Landing. Some pledged support if it meant dethroning the incompetent monarchy. Others were wary. He knew he would have to travel across the realm soon, meeting with rulers to secure alliances or at least neutrality. But tonight he simply wanted a moment of rest. Ser Davos knocked gently and entered. "Pardon the intrusion, Jon, but I think you should see this." He held out a crumpled parchment sealed with a broken wax emblem. "Came by Raven just now." Jon took the parchment. The seal was unfamiliar, but the contents were straightforward. It was from a self-declared heir to the Targaryen line across the narrow sea, claiming that King's Landing would be reclaimed by rightful dragon's blood in the coming year. They warned Jon Snow not to grow too comfortable in his new seat of influence. Jon read it twice, passed it to Davos, and exhaled slowly. Another pretender. Or maybe they truly have Targaryen blood. It never ends. Does it? Davos's eyes flickered. No, lad, it doesn't. But we do what we can to ease the realm's suffering. Let tomorrow's battles come tomorrow. Jon nodded, setting aside the letter. He stared into the fireplace, the flames dancing across the stones. His blockade had ushered in this new era, but it also left him with responsibilities he could not abandon. The shape of the future was uncertain. Would it be councils or monarchs, peace or another round of chaos? He remembered the words of Maester Aemon, "Love is the death of duty." He had learned that duty sometimes required choices that weighed heavily on the soul. Yet love for the realm, for the people who suffered, had also driven him to this point. In a way, the blockade was both duty and love intertwined, a desperate gambit to protect the living from themselves. The next few weeks saw King's Landing slowly stabilize. Street fires were doused, and the Watch established regular patrols. The Transitional Council busied itself drafting rules for ration distribution, settling disputes, and negotiating with merchants to revive trade. House Tyrell was officially thanked in a public ceremony for providing the grain, though Lady Marlora accepted the gratitude with a heavy heart, still uneasy about the blockade's grim toll. Yet, she saw the necessity of it, and her people were proud that the Reach's bounty had averted a greater catastrophe. Jon continued to keep a careful eye on the political undercurrents. Some ambitious lords, seeing the power vacuum, tried to curry favor with the council, positioning themselves for a more permanent role. The faith tentatively reasserted its influence, though it lacked a high septon with widespread support. The small folk, emboldened by the new distribution system, voiced their concerns more openly, occasionally holding assemblies in the squares. Jon had the City Watch protect these gatherings rather than quell them, reinforcing the notion that dialogue, not violence, would shape the future. Inevitably, cracks appeared. Corruption did not vanish overnight. A few gold cloaks tried to skim off the grain supply until they were exposed and punished by the council. Some wealthy families continued to hoard what food they could buy, but the city's new ration system made that more difficult. Riots still broke out in pockets of the city, often driven by frustration and old rivalries. Each time, Jon's forces, alongside the Reformed Watch, moved quickly to contain the violence. The people grew more accustomed to this presence, seeing it less as an occupying army and more as a shield against chaos. Still, the realm beyond the city stirred. Ravens came bearing demands from the Vale to clarify the future of the monarchy. The North remained loyal in spirit to Jon, but maintained a healthy distance from the capital's affairs, focusing on its own recovery after the wars. Dorne, as ever, watched from afar, not eager to leap into the city's politics unless forced. The Riverlands, ravaged by repeated conflicts, simply hoped for a respite from marauding armies. One crisp morning, Jon convened the Transitional Council in the hall once used for smaller feasts in the Red Keep. He had summoned representatives from each major faction: nobility, the faith, the merchants' guild, and the commoners' assembly. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone knew that the decisions made here would echo across the Seven Kingdoms. Jon stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back. "We have stabilized King's Landing," he began. "No one can deny that, but our work is far from done. We must establish either a new monarchy or confirm the council's authority across the realm. The great houses will not wait forever. They demand to know where King's Landing stands." A merchant with a short beard and keen eyes spoke up. "My lord, trade is rebounding, but uncertainty is our greatest enemy. We cannot negotiate new routes or alliances if we fear a new king will seize our assets." A wizened septon, wearing the simple robes of the faith, nodded. "Indeed, the people need spiritual and moral guidance, and only stability can provide that. Whether by a king or council, we must have a lawful structure that all can respect." A minor lord with a limp, from an old line of bannermen to the Targaryens, cut in. "Some have suggested Jon Snow take the throne by popular acclamation. The small folk respect him, and his blood ties, rumored though they may be, lend credence. Would that not be simpler than forming a new system no one has ever seen?" Jon steeled himself. He repeated what he had said before. I have no desire to be king. We stand at a crossroads. The old ways have brought us endless war. A single ruler, no matter how good, can be corrupted or overthrown. I propose we extend the council's reach, involve the other great houses, and form a representative body that can govern fairly. At this, the debate exploded. Some lords balked, crying that a realm without a king was unnatural. Others argued that the monarchy had repeatedly failed, and that it was time for a new chapter. Voices rose, tempers flared, and it took Jon's firm hand and Brienne's commanding presence to restore order. The council recessed without a definitive decision, but the seeds of something new were firmly planted. Outside, in the courtyard, Jon spoke privately with Davos and Brienne. "We might be looking at years of negotiations, if not decades," he remarked. "Westeros was built on the idea of kings. To uproot that won't be easy." Davos nodded. But you've kept the city from starving. You've shown them that cooperation can work. If that's not a foundation to build upon, I don't know what is." Brienne added, "Whatever path they choose, it's theirs to choose now. You've given them that freedom." Jon gazed at the Red Keep's tall spires, remembering the countless stories of kings and queens who had passed through its halls, mad, wise, cruel, and kind, each leaving their mark. He wondered if the ghosts of Targaryen's past watched him from the shadows, judging or perhaps laughing at the notion that Westeros could change so radically. The Iron Throne still stood, a silent sentinel to an age that might be ending. Winter's breath fully descended upon the capital not long after. The nights were cold, and frost glittered on the city's rooftops. Yet the people did not freeze or starve. The flow of grain from the Reach and Storm's End continued steadily, carefully monitored to avoid hoarding. For the first time in a long while, King's Landing faced winter with something resembling hope. Jon oversaw the distribution of firewood, cut from distant forests in the Reach and brought down by barge. The roads were less passable in the cold, but still guarded. Meanwhile, rumors persisted of external threats, a claimant to the Targaryen name gathering FO. Rhys in Essos, a minor Lannister branch calling for the restoration of their house, and even new stirrings among the Iron Islands for independence. But for the moment, the fragile peace in King's Landing held. During a frigid dawn, as Jon walked along the battlements of the Red Keep, he considered his next steps. He longed to return to the north, to the quiet snows of Winterfell or even the far wilderness beyond the Wall, where he might find peace after so many wars. But each time he thought of leaving, the weight of responsibility pulled him back. If he left now, would the Transitional Council survive or would it fracture under pressure? As if summoned by his thoughts, Ser Davos joined him on the ramparts. The old smuggler wrapped his cloak tight against the wind. "News from the north," he said, handing Jon a letter. "Sansa writes that she has matters in hand. The lords remain loyal, and the harvest was decent enough before the snows came." Jon read the letter, a softness creeping into his expression. He could almost hear Sansa's voice in her words, calm and measured, but with a hint of warmth for her estranged brother. She encouraged him to do what he felt was right for the realm, affirming that the North could take care of itself. It eased his mind somewhat, knowing his home stood strong, but it did not simplify the problem at hand. They continued walking along the battlements, peering out over the city. Thin columns of smoke rose from chimneys, mingling with the dawn light. King's Landing had always been a sprawling, chaotic metropolis, full of life and death in equal measure. Now, under Jon's watch, it at least had a chance to reclaim its vitality without the constant specter of tyranny looming over it. Davos broke the silence. "You've done more for this city than you realize, Jon. The blockade was harsh, but it forced the snakes to slither out into the open. There's a chance now, maybe a slim one, but a chance for real, lasting change." Jon nodded. "I know, but there's a question that's been in my mind. Did I do the right thing? Starving a city to bring about change. It feels like a betrayal of everything I stand for." Davos sighed. "I can't say it was good, but sometimes the choices are between greater and lesser evils. Think of the wars that might have happened had the city remained under that puppet king's rule. or if some other tyrant seized the throne. We saw King's Landing burn once already. The blockade, dreadful as it was, might have prevented a repeat of that catastrophe. Jon turned his gaze from the city to the sunrise. The light painted the sky with gold and pink hues, a fleeting beauty over a land scarred by conflict. If the realm finds a better path, if the small folk can live without fear, then maybe it was worth it, he said, his voice quiet but firm. The price was high, but at least there's a hope that we're not condemning another generation to endless war. In the days that followed, the council made incremental progress. Proposals were drafted to formalize the powers of the council within the city and to invite envoys from other regions to participate in a grand assembly the following spring. The idea was to discuss whether Westeros should remain a united kingdom under a single ruler, transition to a collective monarchy with diminished powers, or adopt a more decentralized system akin to the old days when each region was almost autonomous. Jon knew that forging consensus among so many rival interests would be nearly impossible. Even so, the very act of convening such a grand assembly was historic. Lords from the Vale, the North, the Riverlands, the Westerlands, what remained of them, the Reach, Dorne, the Stormlands, and the Iron Islands would gather. Each region had its own scars and ambitions, and each would have to be heard. For Jon, it felt like he was trying to piece together a shattered mirror, hoping to reflect a single image of peace. Meanwhile, life in King's Landing resumed a semblance of normalcy. The markets reopened, albeit with fewer wares. Street performers played again in the squares, bringing fleeting moments of levity. The faith held services in the Great September, praying for the city's renewal. Children, once too hungry to play, could be seen chasing one another through the alleys. None of it was perfect. Hunger still lurked in many corners, crime persisted, and tensions between different factions threatened to ignite at the slightest provocation. But day by day, the city breathed a little easier. Jon spent his mornings meeting with the council, his afternoons riding through the streets, observing firsthand the city's recovery, and his evenings corresponding with distant lords or meeting with those who sought audience. At night, he'd collapse onto his bed, his dreams a tumult of faces, those he had lost, those he had saved, and those whose fate remained uncertain. Ghost lay at his side, ever vigilant, as though to remind Jon he was never truly alone. One evening, just as the city's bells tolled for dusk, Lady Marlora Tyrell requested a private audience with Jon in a small sitting room overlooking the keep's gardens. Jon found her there, dressed in a simple gown of Tyrell green, her eyes pensive as she gazed at the moonlit roses below. She turned to him and managed a thin smile. "My Lord Snow," she began, motioning for him to sit. "I wanted to speak with you before I leave for Highgarden tomorrow." Jon took a seat across from her, noticing the fatigue in her eyes. "Of course, Lady Marlora. I regret we have not spoken much lately. You've done more than your share to keep the city fed." She clasped her hands. "I did as we agreed, and I believe it was the right decision for the good of the realm. Even so, I am burdened by the thought of the suffering we caused. Whether or not it was necessary, the cost was enormous." Jon's face hardened slightly with guilt. "You're not alone in that burden. It will be mine as well until my last day. I wish there had been another way." Marlora nodded, eyes flickering with the reflection of candlelight. "As do I, but we cannot change the past. Perhaps now King's Landing can move forward, and the Tyrells can once again be a source of stability and prosperity." Jon reached out, lightly placing a hand over hers. "They will, Lady Marlora. You have shown wisdom beyond your years. I hope House Tyrell thrives and continues to nourish Westeros in more ways than one." She smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through her sadness. "Thank you, Lord Snow. I am sure we will meet again when this grand assembly is called. Until then, my people will keep sending grain, carefully allocated of course. But Highgarden needs rebuilding too. Our fields are fertile, yet war has left scars on our defenses. I must ensure our homeland is secure, in case others see our renewed strength as a threat." Jon bowed his head in understanding. "You must do what is best for your house. If you have need of the North or any other allies I can muster, Do not hesitate to send word." She stood, and John rose with her. They walked to the window, looking out at the gardens. The cool night air carried the scent of winter roses, which thrived even in the capital's mild winter climate. Marlora exhaled softly. "There is beauty here, even after all the city has endured. Perhaps that is a sign that life can flourish again." John thought of the cyclical nature of seasons, of the arrival of winter and the promise of spring. Perhaps it is. The following dawn, Marlora Tyrell departed with a small escort. John watched from the ramparts as her caravan made its way through the city gates, carrying with it the future of House Tyrell and a portion of the new era's hopes. In the weeks to come, more shipments arrived from Highgarden, and the blockade was but a memory, albeit one that still cast a long shadow. Small folk and nobles alike whispered about how Jon Snow had used hunger as a weapon, forcing the city to bend. Some called it ruthless, others necessary. All wondered what would happen when the threatened Targaryen pretender arrived or when the next crisis gripped the realm. Yet, for the first time in recent history, King's Landing was not ruled by fear. The Transitional Council took root, made mistakes, learned from them, and continued. The idea of a single king still appealed to many, but no clear candidate had stepped forward with enough credibility and moral authority to claim the throne. Jon Snow remained the reluctant guardian of the realm, refusing the crown while guiding the city's slow climb toward stability. He would stand in the throne room from time to time, looking upon the Iron Throne. He'd recall his father Ned Stark, who had served as Hand of the King here, only to be executed on false charges. He'd think of the madness that had claimed kings before, the dragonfire that had engulfed entire armies, and the countless innocents who had paid with their lives for the ambitions of the powerful. That memory kept him resolute. He would not sit upon that throne, nor would he allow another tyrant to do so without challenge. Months passed, and winter tightened its grip. The roads became difficult to traverse, but the city had enough stores of food to keep starvation at bay. Reports from across the realm indicated a mix of concern and cautious optimism about King's Landing's new governance. Some lords denounced it as heresy against the old ways, while others watched with curiosity. Everyone braced for the assembly that would convene when the snows thawed. By that time, the city looked remarkably better. Houses were rebuilt, refugees returned or moved on. The council had organized a modest system of city workers to clear debris, fix public wells, and keep the streets passable. For a city so often battered by warfare and tyranny, the changes felt like a small miracle. And though tensions lingered, the promise of a grand debate on the realm's future gave people something they had not possessed in a long while: hope. Jon Snow spent his days deeply involved in council affairs, forging alliances, writing letters to lords, and ensuring that the city watch remained fair and disciplined. Ghost was ever at his side, a silent reminder of Jon's northern roots and the primal bond he shared with the wild. Ser Davos became the unofficial steward of the Transitional Council, bridging gaps with his pragmatic wisdom. Ser Brienne oversaw the training of new recruits for the Watch and served as a moral compass for those who wavered. Together, they formed a kind of triumvirate, each dedicated to seeing the city through this uncertain period. At night, Jon sometimes allowed his mind to wander back to simpler times. His youth at Winterfell, before he knew who he truly was. He remembered the crisp air, the snow underfoot, the hush of the godswood. But that life felt distant now, another world. His experiences beyond the wall, his battles against the Night King, and his role in shaping the aftermath of the Great War had transformed him irrevocably. No matter where he went, he would carry these burdens and responsibilities. One cold night, as he sat by the fire in his quarters, he penned a letter to Sansa. He tried to convey the scope of what was happening in King's Landing, the blockade's aftermath, the growing acceptance of a council, the uncertain future. He wrote of his doubts, his hopes, and the faint glimmers of progress he saw. He sealed the letter and handed it to a trusted Ravenkeeper, knowing it would be a difficult journey north. In the days that followed, he received reports that roving bands of mercenaries had appeared in the Riverlands, claiming allegiance to this rumored Targaryen pretender. The uneasy peace began to show signs of strain. Jon dispatched scouts to learn more, and he consulted with the council on how best to respond. Some cried out for a preemptive strike, while others insisted they wait for confirmation. Jon, recalling the horrors of open warfare, opted for a cautious approach. They would strengthen city defenses and coordinate with the Riverlands to contain any raids. It was in this tense atmosphere that the first signs of spring emerged. The snowdrifts in the streets melted into slush. The days grew a bit longer, and the biting wind softened. With spring came movement. Lords traveling from their seats, merchants preparing caravans, and ships setting sail from ports that had been iced over or blockaded. The Grand Assembly, promised to be unlike any gathering since the Targaryen conquest, drew near. Ravens flew in and out of the capital every day, carrying replies from the major houses. The Vale would send Lady Robin Arryn's chief advisor, as Robin himself was still deemed too frail for the journey. The North, under Sansa Stark, agreed to send representatives, though it remained uncertain if Sansa would come in person. Dorne promised an envoy of several key lords. The Stormlands would see Gendry Baratheon's arrival, accompanied by some of his knights. The Iron Islands, under Yara Greyjoy, might appear, albeit reluctantly. The Westerlands, fragmented by the downfall of House Lannister, would send a coalition of lesser lords. The Riverlands, battered as they were, would attend with a delegation led by Edmure Tully if he could manage the journey. Each faction had concerns, demands, and long-standing grievances. As the thaw continued, Jon oversaw the logistical preparations for hosting so many guests in King's Landing. Accommodations were arranged, the city watch was reinforced to prevent riots, and a schedule of sessions was tentatively devised. Some in the city were excited. This was a historic moment, a chance for a new beginning. Others were cautious or fearful, suspecting that such a gathering might spark another civil war if tensions ran high. Jon, for his part, steeled himself for a long and difficult process. The blockade had been the catalyst that brought the city to its knees and paved the way for this opportunity. Now, the real work of rebuilding a shattered realm lay ahead. He wondered if future generations would remember these days as the turning point for Westeros. He hoped they would not remember him as a monster who starved the capital, but as a man who made a tragic choice in pursuit of peace. One afternoon, a hawk-eyed scout returned from the Riverlands with a sealed missive. It confirmed that the rumored Targaryen pretender had established a foothold near Maidenpool. The mercenaries under this banner were well armed, and local lords were wary. They had not yet marched on the capital, but they made threatening overtures. The scout also noted that envoys from this group were rumored to attend the assembly, possibly to stake a claim to the throne. Jon grimaced at the news. If a Targaryen claimant appeared and gained support, all the delicate work of forming a new system could be undone by the lure of the old monarchy. Still, he would not deny them entry. He had promised an open forum for all. Spring blossomed into a milder season than many had expected. The city's people shed their winter rags, and new traders arrived at the ports, bringing fresh goods and curious visitors. The scars of famine still lingered in the shape of haunted eyes and slender frames, but the blockade was over. The granaries now had enough supply for daily bread, though no one lived lavishly. Tension still simmered below the surface, but King's Landing was a far cry from the chaos of only a year ago. At last, the time came for the Grand Assembly to commence. Banners from every corner of the realm fluttered in the breeze as their delegations arrived, some with large retinues, others with only a handful of trusted companions. The city's population swelled, inns filled to capacity, and common folk thronged the streets to catch glimpses of lords, ladies, and foreign dignitaries. The Transitional Council had done its best to maintain order, but the city hummed with anticipation. Jon Snow stood at the gates of the Red Keep to personally greet each major delegation. Ser Davos flanked him on one side, Ser Brienne on the other. Ghosts sat by Jon's feet, watchful as ever. They welcomed Edmure Tully from the Riverlands, Gendry Baratheon from the Stormlands, Lady Marlora Tyrell returning from Highgarden, a trio of Dornish lords in flowing robes, and the Vale's envoy carrying Lady Arryn's banner. The North's party arrived led by a Northman lord in Sansa's stead, for she had chosen not to travel personally. The Westerlands delegates came under a patchwork banner. Yara Greyjoy arrived last, her presence brimming with the raw confidence of the Iron Islands. Each greeted Jon with varying degrees of respect, curiosity, and wariness. Rumors flew that the Targaryen Pretenders delegates would come as well, though they had yet to show. Some whispered they might arrive on a dragon, a rumor that no one could confirm. Jon dismissed such talk as scaremongering. The real drama would unfold in the halls of the Red Keep, where these lords and ladies, each with their own agenda, would debate the future of the realm. On the morning of the first assembly, the throne room was filled as it hadn't been in years. Rows of benches had been set up before the dais. The Iron Throne loomed behind, untouched. Jon Snow entered from a side corridor, wearing simple garb of black and gray. He walked calmly to the dais, but he did not sit on the throne. Instead, he turned to face the gathered lords, ladies, and representatives. The murmuring in the hall quieted, and a hush fell. Jon's voice carried through the chamber, steady and firm. "Welcome, one and all, to King's Landing. You have traveled far and braved many hardships to reach this assembly. We gather here to decide the future of Westeros, whether we remain 7 kingdoms under one ruler, 7 independent realms, or seek some new structure altogether. In the time since the last Great War, this city has been starved, battered, and left without a monarch. Yet it stands. You stand. Let us speak openly and honestly, for the choice we make here will echo for generations." A solemn weight settled over the throne room. For a moment no one spoke. Then Gendry Baratheon rose, his voice echoing. "Lord Snow, we thank you for your hospitality and your effort to stabilize this city. Let it not be forgotten that many lives were saved by your actions, even if some suffering came first. Now, as Lord of Storm's End, I stand ready to discuss a path forward that benefits all." One by one, other representatives voiced their initial positions or simply offered greetings. The debates and negotiations that followed would be long and complex, weaving through matters of taxes, trade, justice, and yes, the question of who, if anyone, should wear a crown. This was the moment Jon Snow had envisioned when he had chosen to blockade King's Landing, to force the realm to confront its dysfunction and find a better path. Whether it would succeed or lead to further division remained to be seen. And so, under the watchful gaze of the empty Iron Throne, the lords and ladies of Westeros commenced the greatest council in the realm's history. The memory of famine and strife still lingered like a specter, reminding everyone of the harsh method by which Jon Snow had set the stage. Yet, in that same memory lay a lesson. The people of Westeros could not endure another catastrophic war or the whims of a tyrant. The realm was at a crossroads, with hope and fear intertwined. As the first voices were raised in debate, Jon stood silently, weighing his role as a guardian of this fragile peace. He remembered the vow he had made in the crypts of Winterfell to protect the living at all costs. Now he was fulfilling that vow in the best way he knew, by striving to give the realm a future worth living in, even if it meant airing the guilt of how he had brought them all here. The story of Jon Snow using the Tyrell food supply to starve out King's Landing so that it might finally free itself from tyranny would become the stuff of both ballads and condemnation. Some would call him a savior, others a butcher. But as the Grand Assembly opened in earnest, it became clear that the blockade was just one chapter in the ongoing saga of Westeros. The next chapters would be written by the hands of lords and ladies debating under the specter of a throne that had consumed so many. And in those uncertain days, a faint light of possibility shone over King's Landing, a promise that the cycle of bloodshed and oppression could, if the realm willed it, finally be broken.